recording. So, in regards to the session, like, I will try to start with kind of an introduction. What is this topic? What is the reality games as a concept, and then also how they work. But then I will also try to build kind of almost, you could say, micro plays of playing the situations in along as we go through them. And this is something like, if I'm not doing it enough or well enough, you can pester me on this and say that I'm performing too monologuely. So, but I start first to kind of introduce the topic. So, reality games. What is that? And also, like, anybody who wants to say something, ask something, just jump in. No, nothing else needed. So there are many concepts in this space which people know maybe from the direction like LARPs or live action role playing, which is but it's just the one concept along a space that has had things like pervasive games, alternate reality games, street games, and many others of different kind of emphasis and size. And I could maybe use the kind of comparison to live action role playing because it's maybe the most known of the things to kind of open what is different then about reality games. But like, reality games was a concept or quote unquote movement. It was too small to really be a movement, but and the people in it were not really preachers. So but along the same time, when there was this sort of sudden period of development in LARP culture, which led to this concept of Nordic LARPs, for example. So in Scandinavian circles, there was this sort of like across Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, particularly, this sort of certain community of development that kept on meeting in a not really a seminar, but some kind of a conference called Knudpunkt or Knudpunkt or Solmukohta, depending on which country it was, which still exists, but I would really roughly say that it's not maybe as interesting as it was, and certainly not as kind of groundbreaking. That's a dramatic word, but nevertheless. But so in comparison to LARPs, the difference, like in the discourse of that time, LARP wasn't so established a concept. There was actually, people were recognizing that there were people who were approaching this sort of gaming or playing with language, physical spaces in different ways, and taking multiple directions. Like, also the tabletop role playing people were part of this discourse back then, and then the site that was sometimes called, when it needed a name, was called reality games, were that suspicious bunch of people who were wanting to challenge even the fact that you have to make a game. There was a certain kind of sense that if you just make games like LARPs, what you're just doing is you're repeating the forms that we have in, of course, theater, even performance arts, but all arts, which is that you're kind of trying to make this package that is like, here's the artwork, and that also separates it from reality. And that's fine and dandy. You can do that. But if everything is that, then something is lost. And what is lost is the possibility of looking at that if we look at our reality, so to speak, we are more seeing a kind of a contest, to put it in blunt terms, even a battle of what does everything mean, and what should one do when one sees a pattern of X, Y, and Z. Like, and this then cascades down to everything is like, what do you do on a cafe door, or what do you do when you see a street sign, or what do you do when you hear a particular word, because the doing is also internal, not just external. Like, what do you think when you hear the word lion or whatever word? But it is it's a very much a kind of like the contest is actually kind of almost like against the hegemony. You could call that consensus reality from some perspectives, but it's this sort of like a thing ruled by tradition. Like, this means this because this is what it meant before, uh, and and then if we reflect or compare that with game structures, what these kind of game structures where you change your behavior could offer is the possibility of bringing a painting palette to that reality. Like, and this happens already if you're making, say, a LARP or something like saying, oh, now we're playing the street game of this and this type. It's sort of already that. Like, you're saying now things are different in this place. But it similarly happens, and now I actually hit the right picture. Um, uh, I'm not going through a chain of pictures, but I have some pictures to support this. Like, in a way, it happens even in the sense of somebody coming like a street performer and 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 putting like a piece to collect money, receptacle to collect money in front of them. That's introducing a different interaction. Of course, in the case of street performer, they are relying that there is this pop-up emergent interaction that people know it's part of the convention, so it can appear, or it might have some rules around it whether it can or not, but nevertheless. Um, um, but okay, get rid of that. So, but with that, there is this like similarity if we create something that is not recognized by this world, like a game where, say, all communication is limited between a group of people who are playing to simply pointing out to things, or something much more complicated that we build like roles, characters even, and like the LARPers were doing, where like this shopping center is actually a meeting place for vampires, and we are vampires, and when we meet somebody else in the game, we can use this para reality to play. Um, um, but but this possibility of having this painting palette, that we can look at what's happening with this kind of mechanics and games as a way to be able to paint into this and be able to present new things, not just struggle within the conventions, but completely kind of reset the situation into an edit mode. Maybe that's a good way of thinking about it. It's like edit mode towards reality. And then, of course, immediately the question becomes, what are the tools or instruments of that edit mode? And this was kind of, roughly speaking, the reality games direction, which, like I said, was utterly small. I can say maybe Gabriel Widing from Sweden, who's currently now, I think, in arts, but was one of these game makers alongside myself. So as an example of this, as a kind of a reality game, I, for example, made this religion that lasted for, I think, 1.5 months, where people were who they were, and the only addition was that there was this fictionally created reality religion, which was actually described as holy book. So it was the holy text that was actual rules of the game. So in a way, it was already kind of part of the world. And then people kind of built to themselves this sort of fictional belief that they were playing, but this, of course, spread throughout their lives. Like, they would be in this religion or could play it when they were, watching TV or meeting other people in this religion, whatever the situation is. So there was no really limit. So that's an example of kinds of games that can lead to, of course, that religion was not just made as fiction, but it had a theme of all expression is sacred. but then it doesn't exactly say, or it has conflicts on what does it mean that it's sacred. So the whole game was playing about like changing our relation to expression in general, and that was the kind of playing ground for it. But that's maybe a kind of summary of what kind of small little movement it was and why it was known as sort of like the extreme fringe of this sort of games with reality. And it's also different from alternate reality games, which is an American movement. But nevertheless, does that give a picture? Any comments on this summary description of what we're looking at?
I think it's a great summary. I mean, I am very much uninformed about the movement, so for me, everything was new.
Everybody else is. It's very hard to find anything about it. It's too small.
I've heard about it sort of when a friend of mine made like fiction mixed with reality, fiction mixed with documentary transmedia project, and he did mention it. So I read like a Wikipedia page. That's how much I was exposed before. But the thing I want to say is that this immediately relates to the conversations we've been having. I mean, from a very different perspective, right? But to the sort of possibility of playing culture, of approaching culture in a way that it is actionable through play, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So I'm just wanting to know if you have thought further into the intersection of both approaches, or like how they differ, or how they can sort of nourish each other in a interesting way.
Yes, and this is actually what you're saying now is the reason why I thought it's interesting to bring this now into conversation, is to precisely think about that also, like and also why I want to get to the nuts and bolts, because there's a lot of overlap, but also some differences, and those might be useful to look at. But yeah, I think that's you're pointing to the meat of it, so to speak, I think. Any other comments to this rather presentation-y beginning?
There was somebody sent me a link to a documentary the other day about the Institute. So
yeah.
In this sort of ecology or ecosystem of games, where does that sort of fit in?
That's an evolution from alternate reality games, very roughly speaking. So, like some of these movements, they're not clean cut, but I kind of know. I think I even met some of the people in the Institute, like because I met some of the American makers. But like, there was a pathway that there's actually kind of playing culture, which is more art related, that was around San Francisco, and there were like it's a longer term, like decades back movement, which is in itself interesting. But then towards the Institute, there was this period of alternate reality games as a kind of a term, uh, which I think some of the makers of Institute were part of that culture and were part of, like some of the alternate reality games were even big business projects. They made one for uh, Halo, the first Halo being published, and the AI, the Steven Spielberg movie. Um, so these were uh, big projects at the time, and the San Francisco area wing of the games and some of the people there are ultimately people who made the Institute or were part of it, or yeah. So yeah, these are very kind of small little flowers or mushrooms in different patches, but the style of them is interesting. I can talk about it, but I probably won't open because it's a side branch. Like what kind of designates certain features in the style of those games and what makes the differences. Yeah. Now I take it as people can jump in with comments, but if they're not, then I'll try to move from my presentation style to less.
I see one commonality, like in general, let's say this one is also a game of sort, but very like, let's say, it's building its rules on the flight, you know, on the go, let's say. But in each games I've seen, it's mostly like creating a like linearity in time, or some like turn-based, being them turn-based. So like there is one at a time. And how would you express a consensus when there's like turn-based? But let's say consensus is not only expected at the end of turns, but not a accumulation of something that's like, yeah, like so coupled like this, like, okay, you end and then it's my turn. How that, because it's also, yeah, maybe relates to some other stuff.
That's a really good question, actually. Like, I'm kind of resisting of opening the whole nerdy can that comes from there, and kind of summarizing, because like you're hitting on a topic that it's a very relevant point, and then but it's almost like a crossroads that hits to many different directions. But okay, I'll raise a couple of things. I think there was a reason why this LARPing like things and games with reality started to bloom after the coming of the tabletop role-playing games, because structurally, like in its first 10-ish years, the tabletop role-playing games figured out certain things structurally that came to feed game structures in other contexts, and like, because there are kind of LARP-like things before tabletop role games. Like you can find it here and there, and like you can go way back in history and find examples of it. But like why there was this blooming in the kind of wake of tabletop role-playing games, I don't think it's an accident. And one of the reasons is precisely in the area what you're pointing at, is that, so okay, turns. So like one thing that we can introduce here is the kind of the concept of the move, which is kind of like a turn, but it's actually a little bit different. It's more dynamic, potentially. It can function like a turn, but move could also be something that you carry with you, but you can always do. It's very much like a ride. This is something we've talked in many sessions here, like, but it's a kind of interesting possibility. And you see this in kind of developing in the tabletop role-playing game world in inside conversations, like these kind of structures. But that allows you to have something turn-like, in the sense that, okay, I'm carrying this thing, and if there is a moment that it fits there, I'm pushing in this move, but it's more like floating. It's not in a rigid like order of things like turns normally are. It's like floating with you and then inserted at some moment and introducing some interaction. And this structural area, like I said, it's big and nerdy, because then like I could talk a lot about floating structures and how floating structures are used, but these actually became solutions to first create, like, solve this puzzle that tabletop games wanted to have this freedom of anything can happen. The player can do anything. Like, or you can describe your character to sit on the ground for half an hour and look at flowers, or go to talk to a next person about whatever, or like anything. And in order to have that working and to cohere with the world, there were actually many different small solutions that kind of made this possible. But one of the key things is really like not generally being a move structure or turn structure, um, but rather be in this sort of more looking at things that you're capable of triggering, like pushing on, and how to have them kind of affect the world, and then have the world react to it and process that. And I do think some of these things came part of, or became part of the arsenal of making games in reality, whether it was in the form of LARPs or reality games. Like I said, I could say a lot more about that structurally speaking, but that's a start.
One comment as well regarding like turn-based
Mm.
and LARP and other structures. I really like kind of if thinking about like, let's say kind of if you would say dramaturgy is kind of setting things in organizing things in time, and composition is somehow like organizing things in space, kind of, and many like in role playing games, you like tabletops, you many times you have scenarios where something begins and then something ends, and then you have like time jumps. You can, yeah, okay, now we move there because you made the decision and so on, and all that, like and also like in these labs that I have been reading about or participating, like the kind of modern contemporary labs that normally ain't like campaigns. They are more like there is they are kind of one scenario or one event, like let's say 3 days or 1 day or something like that, located in somewhere and so on, and they are usually like divided into acts, little the same way as like kind of other dramaturgies and so on, in many ways. But there is something interesting there, because one way to look at like turn-based is like, now it's my turn, now it's your turn. But the one other like interesting thing is like the kind of unfolding, or like, okay, now we have put our kind of, we have all made our moves, and they are like simultaneously revealed, in a sense, like revealing a new location, revealing a new setup, and then like but so that people also have had time to orient and like kind of like make their inner moves or so on, to reflect on the changing situation or something. Just like I'm really interested in this turn-basedness also as a kind of ritual, because this turn-basedness is always existing in this like real time, but it's kind of like a little like a dam, or suspension, and then everything is, or something is revealed, and then it starts to kind of suspend again, or something like that.
Yeah, I think like that's also like like expanding into this very large topic of, it's not just time management. It's also social management, and well, social order, not in the sense of like rigid order, but like social organization is a better word. Uh, like like one of the things to say in terms of LARPs is like some of them actually have to be kind of very real, like not having turns or certainly not acts. There has been this sort of like flirting with like, hey, we can also use these fictional structures, which I think is a good thing. Like that that they kind of like expanded into also like that it's a power, it's an expansion of your power if you can say we can have an act structure as well. Like so this can work like, isn't it like the real world in a sense, but then suddenly we say this was the end of the act one, which is, it's an interesting kind of mixing of palettes. And I would say like in terms of the reality games, that's also something that certainly exists. It's not like actually many of our social structures are utilized similarly, kind of artificial structuring, like creating a beginning and an end is essentially always artificial um, to anything. Like so there is a lot of power in such structures, and having them in your palette is kind of useful, at least expands the palette. But yeah, like like I said, it's a big area because there's also like, and this was really learned in the tabletop side, is that you don't need to cohere, you don't need to sync up in everything 100%. You could say in tabletop, actually, it almost benefits from the fact that not everything is synced. So in a tabletop where like it's working on language, like somebody is describing the environment and then the others are describing what their characters are doing there, it's generally known, at least in the current times, that what each person is imagining is different. And that's actually okay and can be even a good thing. Um, it's what the game needs is only to sync on things that it needs to be syncing on, wants to be syncing on. So so many of these games are intentionally made in a manner that you could say it's almost lazy syncing, to use programming terminology, that it's only syncing when it needs to sync on something. That if we need to know whether you, say, dropped into a chasm or not, then we sync on that. But then if we are all looking at like a weird creature, we are all actually imagining something slightly different, but we sync only on the thing that is running towards us, and so things like this. So both, like, this is a correlative area with the turns, because it's also, the turns are partly about syncing, and it actually gives you a lot of freedom if you don't sync everything, if you lazy sync on what is our reality. But yeah, like big topics, and like relevant, while building side branches, they're kind of adding to the forest that surrounds this topic, certainly. But the one thing, okay, I could bring as a key, one key aspect, is which is highly correlative with what we have been kind of lately looking at in XORG, is that quite early on, while doing this kind of games, I came to the conclusion that that we're actually much more designing in a filter-like fashion than object-like fashion. Like if I would design a game in real world sense, like a board game, I would be making objects in and of themselves. But if I'm designing a game into reality that already exists, it's actually, what I have to design is how are things that are there modified. But then, like, continuing that thought, I came to, like, through the concept of the role and my kind of qualms about the always marrying role to a character, which was a strong factor in LARPs, for example, that you get a role, you actually get a character, and to kind of de-link those two, and think that whatever modifies you is a role. Like, yes, it could be a character, but it could be just, for example, saying your role is yourself, but tired, to make a very minimal example. That's already a role. But there, if you think about it, you are more thinking about as a modification. But then again, if you're playing a character, what you're really doing is modifying yourself. So it's not altogether different from that. But that means that you get this sort of middle medium where you're designing filter systems, which is a quirky but I think quite functional way of thinking, that like every piece of that system is actually kind of relating through something else rather than being a thing of itself. It's more that what comes through it than being like a sovereign unit, so to speak. And like I could use this. Let's go back actually to, like, let's say the street view. Like if I were to design something to play here, I cannot move the cars, or and people will move by themselves. If I want to make a game where I want to control everything, what I'm asking from people is just a lot of overhead of thinking past all of the things that are there. But if I'm thinking in filters, I'm designing something that can actually create also possibilities of these things being part of the game, but maybe modified in this sense. So, so to slightly nudge this from presentation to slightly more open the interaction, like if I make a filter, let's say this particular street view could be any really, but we can use this because it has a lot of material in it. And I say, for example, that all the advertisements are connected, that they form this sort of almost like a musical score, like a harmony, that when they keep on changing, they are coordinated with each other. And of course, what you're seeing now is a part of a whole score. Let's see if we can play, let's say, with that idea, or is somebody coming up with a better filter, but then think about what these filters do to what you see. It would be nice to be on a real street, but we can do what we have. So now, like, does that kind of a filter, can you see how it potentially could change your relation with the billboards, advertisements, or do you have another filter to propose relating to billboards or anything else?
Yeah, I might have a filter on eye contact and how eye contact is something desirable that grants additional rights or privileges. And I would imagine how that would suddenly, in an urban environment like this, that would dramatically change the way I interact in the space.
Yeah, that is a great example. I can give you a practical example back. When I was in Tokyo for a month and building this sort of, I had to build a game structure as a part of a fictional temple, sort of an art project. But one of the games I made during Tokyo was a game called the game that was eye contact fishing. And this was interesting in Tokyo because it's very different in terms of eye contact than most of the other places. And the key way to play it was to try to establish eye contact. And if it's very short, then you get a very little fish. If you manage to keep it longer, you get a bigger fish. And then, like, if you manage to keep it like couple of seconds, like not just 1 second, then you get a really big fish. And then you can communicate, and we're moving in a group, so people will tell the size of the fishes they got. And then rather than describing the species of the fish, they would describe the moment as the fish. And that game in itself was, just by that so simple rules, was interesting, but also in the sense that it created a filter to Tokyo, because like people could think, like, see how different it is in Tokyo itself. Like, so like that's a good example, the eye contact of a filter, but also how a filter is not just a passive thing. It can be just like how I look at these things, but it can also be a filter to actions. Like there's no really limit on that. So like that is modifying how you use eye contact, but that in itself creates a whole nother range of behavior. So a great example. Any other filter impressions or new filters, whatever you want to bring on this?
I think these two that were proposed, they are kind of kind of connected because it's about kind of also like using mediums that need somehow some sort of like information kind of in order to communicate and kind of convey something, because if those billboards are like connected, somehow also of course like eye contacts are connected, even if they don't kind of reach each other, but through the kind of conventions of culture and so on. So yeah, it's interesting, very visual.
Yeah. my camera sometimes spasses out, but I'm here nevertheless. It's just the camera. I think like there is a kind of visual sense to the filter, but one of the reasons I like filter rather than the lens is to a little bit try to move it to just be visual. Because I could also say like, say a filter that the soundscape around you, even actually saying to people, I tested this, if you say the soundscape is important, changes quite radically their senses because usually the sound is suppressed a bit. And suddenly, like how they take in the soundscape brings up the, or becomes part of the conversation. Like you can also do like a continuation that the soundscape contains like unexpected meanings, and then push that into the pipe of conversation. Like when you find an unexpected meaning, tell about it. And now you might have, say, 4 people listening, and what they then say about the sound space becomes new filters for people to listen, because whatever they say starts to modify their filters, but then it starts to build up meaning also what the soundscape could be. So that's a, like I'm trying to put this sort of minimal, almost like mechanical modules as descriptions. Of course, you can build a lot of through this, but that's an example of like you use a filter and then you push it to whatever the filter produces into a generator, like which is using a filter itself because it's asking a question of tell when you find something unexpected. That's a filter towards what they're expressing. But now, then, when they express it, it becomes a filter for others to listen differently, which means they express again differently, and that becomes the point of generation. So that's a complicated way of saying what's happening, but the mechanics are sort of simple to even tell that to people.
So there's an interesting possibility that I think what happens when you start to think about filters for each sense. Right?
Yeah.
Filters based on contact, filters based on sound, filters based on taste. And like I could imagine through the lens of contact, no pun intended, like, contact, if I'm walking down this busy street, contact means I change directions, or I follow the person who last touched me. Right?
Yeah, that, like, you can use all the senses, and you can also use things that are not normally considered senses, like said, like, even though it's not described as a filter, like in the soundscape, telling people to express something when they find something unexpected in the sound is creating a filter for their expression. So it can also be in the output, so to speak. But then, of course, it can be in the internal behavior. This was sort of opened to me quite quickly when you thought that all the roles are ultimately filters. Like they are modifiers. And that, of course, roles address a lot of, not just like internal behavior, not just in what you physically do, but even how you think. And suddenly you're in the space where filters are potentially everywhere, or usable in every situation.
I got maybe a couple of filter, I don't know, like wish.
Yeah.
Would be like a filter maybe around time, like time that people that around, let's say, I don't like to putting exactly this way, but let's say the time that they can be freely approached and be listening other, it could be agnostic to context. Like mostly it's already, there is a defined level of interaction out there. Like when you go to a store, you're expected to ask a question and then tell something, this and that, and it's repeated again when you're waiting on the queue as well. But like on a street, for example, it doesn't happen if you don't need something that you go someone. And in terms of knowledge, it is really scoped down to asking address, time, anything. Or if someone approaching you with a shirt, like actually, if, for example, maybe I shouldn't either, it could be cool to see like some time that people are okay to, you know, talk about stuff, or which stuff they so that it could be yeah, not topics, but just the time, like very minimum time that you can totally give someone. Or also one more thing, like how could we let's say there is again like a turn base, or there is like chat like this right now, for example, like everybody gets, like, I don't like using this word, but can tolerate this, you know, talk like 5 more minutes. You just write there very honestly, like 2 more minutes, 1 more minute. Like, I mean, instead of that, we are only I think only instrument we got at left at hands or by design is intervening that. But I don't think an average consensus, you know, time accumulation of those, you know, or average, sorry, could work like a countdown, that dynamic. But it's like you feel good, you know, like it's not like some, like, you know, that's like could feel, I would feel more comfortable if I knew I got some certain time, regardless of that's going down or up. But that's for cool. I mean, would be something.
Yeah, this is an area that I can add another, not as core element, but a useful technique, is that one of the things I used a lot was pins. You know, the ones with the where you can put a needle through and make this sort of pin. Like this is around, like when I was using these techniques in more in the art context, like in 2010-ish, there came this sort of possibilities to print different pins quite cheaply and send your images and so on. Because what's interesting about the pins could be done in other ways, but they're quite hardy, less drain, and can be put in many positions because the pins hold them, so that you can put them in a visible position. But when you have different types, they can be the information channel that you're missing, that the reality won't give you by itself. Like you're seeing a person, and of course the simplest way is to see a pin, you know that that person is part of the game. But it can also, like with different pins, have different knowledge. Like for example, I have time. Of course you could put it like even in the sense of just putting it as a sentence, I can give you time, and that can work like outside, like I have the topic of groups and people and the sociality of these games upcoming, because it's core, but like, but just to address it shortly, like if you wanted it to bleed over the game line, you might put it in, I can give time for you, because you want to play not just with players, but create the opportunity that this actually bleeds to people who are not part of the game. If you would want to keep it in the game, you might put a symbol on it that the players know, but others don't know, and you have that range. But the pins were precisely forming these information channels that could lead to emergent finding of the game as well. Like I did this in a couple of cities, like, and the players could just run into each other, like without anybody being present necessarily. Like that was always a possibility. But yeah, like, and then kind of well, this touches upon another core topic, which is kind of rites and rituals in the widest sense of those words, and how you can use those to build like what you design as a kind of rite or ritual, which is really like a made-up convention. That's how I often like to think about it, because that opens up the possibility. It doesn't have to have religious connotations, but for example, that you would design this convention of like what happens when you give time, how do you give it, what are the rules for that, and then put all of those rules inside, say, a pin that then generates its interactions by meetings and people calling upon that pin. And now you're already doing like a thread of the system of the game into the world.
I find it a little kind of annoying, kind of that this sort of like street is always a place where people just like pass, and how to leave some sort of like meaningful mark or so on. How to make people stop or something, and and kind of if there would be a very big like collective circle of play somehow, or a circle of magic of play somehow, like for instance, it would be very cool if, let's say, people would by their own action be able to collectively change what we see on those billboards. Okay, now they are marketing you what Bud Light or something like that, and so on. This sort of like products, but what if you would act differently somehow? Could you somehow change those billboards? And of course, like maybe by imagining them, maybe kind of stopping to discuss and imagine what else could be there or something.
Yeah, that opens up. Okay, my camera is really behaving badly, but it's okay, I guess. But that actually opens up one of the sort of key topics I could introduce, which is it's kind of like on the continuance of what is the kind of sociality of these games, and it starts from like especially when you're designing these games, like the game always starts like inside of you, like and even for the players, it has to kind of be, the seed has to be placed inside of the players. That in a way, that's where the difference, the path aside from the norm has to start from. Like that's where the first step has to be taken. But then in order it to be more than a singular person, then there are many, many ways to kind of build this sort of, how does it become shared? And of course, this is just reflected in many of these games that, okay, we just collect a group of people, and then in the beginning we give them brief of what are the rules, and then we make a couple of persons who you can go and check if you need rules, like kind of facilitators / game masters and so on. Like, but like underneath all of that, what they're addressing is how does the sociality build up? Because I think it's a larger question. Like the pins are already a note on that. Like the earlier pin example is like, if you make the pins actually sort of understandable for the world, then you're designing to bleed, to designing to go over the player structure, probably intentionally. But then like that, how does this relate to the billboards? Well, what you're always doing when you're expanding socially is you end up in realization that really this is all entering into a kind of a giant contest. And I do think like one shouldn't kind of look beyond it being like a contest and a battle, because that's how it kind of behaves, which is like, what do things mean in the wider sense, not just what's the word for them, but what should one do what should one think when one sees something. And along that path also comes like who can change things, etc. They cascade from that. And why it's a battle is that you notice that there are certain areas where you have more leeway, but generally you have less than you think. Like you have to be kind of clever about how you spread things. Like for example, why the pins were useful was because you're using personal space, which you can have with the players, and you're introducing a new channel, but it's not contesting existing channels, which often faces the difficulty of being next to impossible or very hard to do. So so for like you're always kind of measuring the challenge of that battle. How large a giant of meaning are you facing? Like in the case of a billboard, it's pretty huge. It's like, and of course you can go and let's say put something else on the billboard, but then you know that the giant can react like police comes and takes you away or whatever. Yeah, and of course that can be fine as part of the game, like if that's accepted by everybody. But you have to know this giant and how does it react in this case. And but then you can create this sort of other ways, like for example, like I started with the filter that let's say the billboards are forming like a concert, which is kind of like trying to use their meanings or material in the sense of a filter, that you don't have to fight the giant because you're just changing what comes out of the giant, and kind of building a different kind of sense to it, which then the players hold, which is limited in some ways, but also enabling because it allows you to play with the things that without getting yourself in trouble immediately. But there could be other things, like for example, if you take the behavior of billboards and move it somewhere that is less contested, like wasteland, like like small little courtyards, putting posters there, um, like places in unnoticed corners, etc. Then you're still challenging a giant, but it's a much smaller giant. Or the giant's eyes are not so aimed towards that or interested in that, and that's another way you can play with this. But like you have to be kind of attentive to that you're always in this context layer of meaning. And this, of course, the sociality in itself is not just a weapon, but really a tool towards this. Is like you can build something between the people, and they together can like feed each other in terms of building a different way of meaning, different way of behavior. Um, but even that comes with the attention of that the field itself will react. It's full of giants that are bigger than you.
I mean, if a game can create some constraint that some other can go giant by doing good, more or better, that would be cool for me. Like if they can feed more people and beating me in that game, I'm cool with that, for example.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
like
It's I think definitely intentionally challenging something is definitely in the palette. It's just that it's always better to know that you're challenging and what kind of things are you challenging and how are you challenging. Because often when you're challenging, then it becomes almost like core of the effort, because it's probably a thing that this needs the most attention and can or has to be even defended and things like this. So that's part of the play itself. Then like, but it's also good to kind of like uh, try to look for options that allow for growth without immediate challenge. So I don't think it's an accident that many of the street sports that have grown over the last few decades, like whether it's skateboarding or parkour, they are utilizing places that are kind of like not so important, like and finding ways to actually kind of utilize the environment differently, yes, but kind of like in a way that is challenging, but sort of like prodding on the fringe, but being able to make space itself for itself by using spaces that are not so cared for, uh, and or changing the relation to space that exists. And I think one of the reasons they have been thriving is because they have a certain smartness. They are not like saying that we can only succeed or thrive or grow if we win our challenge. They're saying, oh, we have this garden space that we have kind of smartly placed out for ourselves, which we are challenged from time to time, but ultimately can keep on growing there. And then we can expand and kind of broaden the space beyond that. And sometimes be kind of pushed back, but it's okay because we can go back to our gardens. And this is, I don't think it's an accident that you have the same pattern in both parkour and skateboarding. That it's a sort of like it's a need for also having this garden of where you grow and where you have skaters meeting each other in a, I don't know, a parking lot with some cement blocks, or like and being kind of fine in that garden in order for that culture to grow. Hopefully that was understandable. I'm taking the
Yeah, I like it very much.
Makes
But-
a lot of sense, yeah, and really interesting to kind of think that the kind of game board or a kind of you kind of you already have the structures you need for the game existing, and then kind of you have some sort of like tool or kind of medium such as like skateboard, and then you like utilize them, and different kind of subcultures emerge, and so on. One other thing that you mentioned before is very interesting also, like if we take the billboard and move it to the desert actually with the billboard, it comes a part of the play in a very concrete sense
yeah.
after that.
Yeah, or make our own billboards in places where people don't expect billboards in itself. Like they can be removed, but they're removed less, you know, like if compared to normal square of places. Like this is an area that I played with a lot. Like I did build playing structures even for like large department stores. Well, the Finns know Stockman. Like I did a game in Helsinki, Stockman, but it had to be designed in a very nuanced manner because those kind of places are like even kind of like weird behavior, just not even weird, but unexpected, like somehow unconventional is maybe the word, can attract the attention of the guards. So, for example, for that, I came up with a technique called camouflage, which is like I made people to watch the people in the store and made a certain pattern of the behavior, like the walking speed, and then a certain distance, and then how you turn and look at certain things that are on offer. Then you might pick one and put one back. So if you thought you were in kind of attention of the guards, you could move into camouflage mode. And this was actually highly useful. Like this was needed for that to work. Like people would, like, you could clearly see a guard was kind of looking at somebody because they were just moving differently. they can pick up on this quite quickly. Like even if they were not doing anything weird or something like utterly like in your face weird, but just like their movement was different, the guards would start to follow them, and then you went into camouflage for 5 minutes, and then the guard would get bored, and you would move on from there. So yeah, it's a whole field in itself.
That's really interesting, sort of like camouflaging back into your consumer identity to blend in the mall. And I'm getting sort of like a lot of situationist vibes, in sense of like, yeah, playing the city, right? Or like attaching a layer of play on top of an urban space that, yeah, I don't know, like it really is like very psychogeographic in a way. I also find it interesting as a way to explore a space or to get to know a space in a way that precisely steps away from the tourist view or the consumer view or the commuter view. Like it is really a distinct mode of engaging with urban space and commercial space in the case of the game in the mall. I find that really nice. I was thinking in terms of the billboards and the eye contact, what would happen if the people who look the most at the billboards could decide what they show, right? Maybe we will have companies paying people to look at them so that they could show whatever they want. That would be terrible. But if it was not that case, I would like to know, yeah, it would be interesting to have like a community owned billboard where people just collectively decide what should be placed there. That could be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the whole topic of what is communicated in the city, actually, this leads to an example I was thinking to go into to kind of practicalize some of these things, because it's this case called social space agency, which existed before economic space agency. It's called SOSA. So that's Exxon SOSA are not like strictly tied, but there is a kind of name inheritance, and this concept of space. Like in SOSA, it was of course social space, and in EXA, it's been economic space. But otherwise, they're kind of separate. But SOSA is kind of a game engine. So one of the reasons why to form the SOSA and why it was designed the way it was designed, which was kind of like, okay, the basic concept was this, like, of course, the name is derived from things like space agencies, like NASA and ESA and like European Space Agency and North Atlantic, I think it is NASA. But it actually took a lot of the early NASA stuff, which was created by fiction writers, that when NASA had to sell itself to people, like why would you put millions and millions into rockets, etc., which was a hard ask for people. Early NASA went to science fiction writers to kind of formulate this story narrative of how to sell this idea that we should go to space, which was of course not necessarily automatic. Like, and there is a lot of kind of framing and writing many different storylines. How, for example, the intro we hear in Star Wars is actually originally from NASA, and goes the pathway that there's an original version for NASA written by a science fiction writer, which then was adopted and modified to Star Trek, which then was adopted and modified again by NASA, taking it back into a new version. But then another thing was to frame these different concepts, and one of them was outer space, and it's sort of scientific term, but it also was part of the story, was to create this sense of a thing to explore. So they built the story about that the age of exploration. Of course, this is early or somewhere middle-ish 20th century, so exploration was a good thing in like not challenged yet in politically. And the story was that the age of exploration in terms of Earth is over, which is of course not true, but nevertheless. But the age of exploration continues, and where it goes is outer space. And it's a kind of responsibility of the humanity to understand where we are. And how to understand where we are is to go to outer space and kind of continue this mapping that is a grand quest of humanity. This kind of storyline still worked at that time. So, and they formed this sort of principle of like a 4-step principle. I leave it for another time because it would be a sort of a side branch, but it's an interesting one. I actually like their 4 steps and stole them for Sosa, because then Sosa made this turn of turning this into social outer space. That is, anything that goes outside of the conventions is entering into social outer space, because immediately when you're there, you don't know what's going to happen. Like when you suddenly introduce a behavior that is different from others, the new space opens, and it's an uncertain space. And just like NASA, the SOSA was to create instruments to travel to social outer space. NASA was to create instruments to travel to outer space, and that instrument could be a technique of conversation. It could be a way of walking. It could be a bunch of filters, which we had a collection of over 100 of. It was a lot of techniques, but those were like rockets in a way, like because they allowed you to launch from the normality to the unconventional. Then you could use those as experiments or experiences or both. Like in a way, like what you learn from there is like what happens with this kind of behavior, but of course it was an experience in itself. And then you could bring that back as knowledge, but also expansion of the human realm, which is like, now this can be done. And then this is what we know about it so far, but it's early knowledge. So Sosa was mirroring NASA, but just like talking about the spaces beyond the roads of convention, so to speak, which was one way we talked about it, that the conventions form like this road system in our world, but there's always space in between the roads. But one of the reasons to formulate this was almost to have a game engine, which can introduce many, many different games while combining them together. Like somebody could make the small game of, say, eye contact, but then you would have this framework where you could plug it in and like have it communicate with other games, and then you could have like the system or the organization. This was one of the projects that really got me interested in organizational structures. This is 2012ish, 13ish, where like giving different roles, also having like a exotic way of getting those roles, and use those to push people into playing the game differently. And then you had this entity which was kind of created, well, out of thin air, but was appearing as organization, association, or any kind of a thing, and behaving really intentionally more than it was. So it would write, for example, opinions or like expert theses for the city. Like this was in Switzerland, Bern. So we wrote this like a 7-point thesis for Bern. And one of the things that was in the list was that like we have evaluated the information spaces in public, and that essentially they are divided between 2 things. One is commercial advertisement, another one is city informatics, like traffic signs and street signs and things like this. Everything else is actually extra. There is such things that are there, like somebody puts a poster somewhere without having a promise, like a right to put it. If they put it with a promise, then it's in a commercial space again, because it has a commercial deal. Everything else is actually outside of that. So the cities don't have communication beyond a couple of side projects of art here, beyond those two giants of the commercial and the city information, and how this in itself, if we treat the city as a media that we read constantly, is leading to a poverty of intelligence, because you're essentially placing a very poor book that the people have to constantly read. Therefore, this is likely to create a lesser intelligence in the populace of the city and things like this, and which is true, sort of, like I would say. But once again, here I also want to underline practically how SOSA as a design was in many ways designed to be able to do that. Both the kind of combining of games and then providing of games through roles and the games themselves, but then forming this entity that could instigate new games, like writing this for the city council. Which then also used actually the route of particular festival, carrying that to the city council. So to parasite on a channel to get it to the city council. There is actually a whole continuum of this, which created a weird dialogue with the city. It's another story. But it's weird when you come through channels that people don't expect. Sometimes they are so surprised that they don't put their defenses up immediately, and you can get through these channels. But that's do say.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's sort of like again to go full circle, I guess, related to the idea of mining a media for something else, or like watching a film to take out tarot cards, or reading the city of the book, sort of like that filter like playable structures upon things that exist. And that is really powerful and really provocative.
And it's certainly not the only way to design this sort of a game, meta game for the games, or a larger game structure, superstructure to hold other games. But it's an example of such. Like, of course, and in there you can quite easily combine fiction and reality. Like SOSA was, like you could see very much inside of it, it was a blend of both. So you could say create like I did an imaginary religion, like you could create an imaginary society of any kind, and then that topic would be open to many, many things. Of course, you could create something that is just an event or just a convention, like you would start teaching people a particular convention of how to behave, like, or you would name yourself as a designer of new conversation models, and you would put it in your title, and then you would use that as a framework to introduce new conversation models, and that would be another way. So that's sort of like examples of the palette of that have this sort of sense that they know that they're playing with giants and along the science, like walking between the feet of these massive giants, but finding ways to like grow in there. Do you see, like, I'll push with the question because I'm still talking way too much. But let's open this to an XORG connection. Like, do you see like interesting or correlations or differences with this kind of directions, the kind of culture we have had in XORG versus this kind of a culture of reality games?
I like a lot, I mean, I've been silent, but listening to everything, I like a lot the idea of sort of like inner banners, camouflaging, very going really much against what a banner is made for, sort of this idea of going contra marketing and hiding banners that almost sounds like windows to me, or doors into something else. And also, you know, again, the idea of this camouflaging in the social space and public space in a very much of a situated manner, and how would that look like? Also, what message would they contain? What door would they open? Which make me think again about cats somehow. And also this, which is probably is an obsession now. And then also this sort of inputs of sort of, you know, you just mentioned the designer of conversation, like having this sort of, again, very situated and mission-driven, almost, or purpose-driven entities or actors or players. It's something that I find really interesting and that I've never really heard of, and it just makes me think a lot. Yeah,
I think the mission driven, it was for me also interesting because there was so little of it in arts, and this, for example, SOSA was funded by an arts context. So so to actually go like kind of not full in, because there was a lot of play like in terms of this, but there was this sort of always possibility to take it as a mission. Was interesting in itself. But in terms of also what you were saying about the sort of direction of kind of camouflage and what comes from there, like one technique, since I'm trying to highlight them from here, is that you always kind of like analyze as it from a design point of view, like things as kind of carriers and vessels. So to make this into an example, like role is a very useful tool, especially when it's separated from you having to be different character, both as a sense of like, of course, modifying persons, like creating an inner loop that runs through the person in addition to outer loops. Like you define something by a filter different, that's like an outer loop, or outer loop that goes to an inner loop, but nevertheless. But then the role is really like, it's kind of like putting a loop that starts from whatever the person is experiencing and putting it into a permutation and then coming back to what they're experiencing. It is very useful. But in addition, it's a vessel. That if you say you have this role, then you can put, for example, like whatever these techniques, like this eye contact, for example, like that could be like, oh, like to make it simply, like, oh, you are in SOSA, you could be or decide to be a researcher that is interested in first contacts with aliens, quote unquote, or aliens being normal people, but now that they're in social outer space, therefore they are aliens themselves also. Anyway, like you could have like somebody being interested in forced contacts, and they would use among their arsenal, they would carry this like playing with eye contact. So now the role is a carrier. It's a vessel that carries that, but also kind of puts it in a certain context. So there's kind of design space there, like how is the role designed, can be changed. But also other things are carriers and vessels, like the pins mentioned earlier. They are carriers because they become channels, and they allow the game to carry and create this sparking points where the game is alighted again between two people meeting with the same pins. So the sort of design in terms of carriers and vessels is kind of at the core, because it's a way to make the game persist in the world, not necessarily forever, but having a way to persist over a period of time or social existence.
Yeah, really cool stuff. Really cool.
Yeah, same here. Actually, this very project I shared, like it's thought like first came out just because of this, like who decides what's there. Like in a weekend we had drawn some stuff on the kitchen, and then some flatmate came back and erased them and stuff that they could live longer, you know, like a vegetarian way of thinking, like, hey, okay, if those animals would live longer, then why did you kill before and then store it and stuff like that. But then in that imagination board, in that stateful art, really there is some, but only a co-ownership context there. But they were to add that new dimension, like on top of advertisements and information. But even if that's an information, it could be info that I'm looking for, or that I want, or something. Yeah, like it was around causes and artists dedicating some revenue to those as well, like some each artwork being a co-op. But these times, really, when I'm walking the streets thinking of, hey, I'm the one exposed, like that's attention matter of, then I should be get paid first, or then we pay to the whoever the owner of that vault. But whose life gets impacted? It's, you know, people. It's just there can be some new models that could be shared. Like it's gonna be fair for buildings, but it's not like a whole advertisement and marketing needs to care more about intentionality. Like if there would be some place just for advertisements, I would go there intentionally and look like creative artworks. And if I was to decide like which artists also gonna be included and stuff, that would be even better. But we cannot really observe democracy and like producer and consumers like treat as inequals and broadcasting kind of way. Like, hey, like take this and that. In everything you can observe that pattern. I think we just need to say something about it by doing something.
Yeah, and it's also, I can say that it's beneficial to see those patterns. Like the one thing I can say from Sosa, that the people who were part of the original group, they all took very like change paths after that. Like in some ways, it actually wasn't easy. I think many of their artistic careers, quote unquote, were suffered from that because it's not very compatible with many of the practices of arts. But it's hard to come from back when you kind of spend a lot of time in that kind of vision and just kind of close that all down. Or, I mean, it's not absolute, but nevertheless, like move from that active kind of way of looking. And so, and I do think it's beneficial with that kind of bitter edge. And the bitter edge is like it also creates a lot of frustration because like a lot of things are so unyielding or so hard to kind of fight against. Like, but it just opens this, like there's so many possibilities and they're so underused, and the world is kind of fighting against using them, which is kind of like that's the position that is both beneficial and has a bitter edge. But I talk too much because I mean there's a lot of history there. There were a lot of things I haven't mentioned, maybe left for another occasion. I like towards your last comment, actually talking about placing art in different places. I could have made a case for a game called Agoa, which simply means a game of art. Which is like a whole parasystem for everything in arts turned into a game, which is a project I designed quite late on. It's kind of almost just a couple of years ago, and it has been used, but it would need like a lot of operations in terms of launching. But it's precisely based on these kind of techniques, but it's essentially like allowing every artwork to exist in the art that is recognized by the world, but also in this game that replicates and expands everything in the art and allows for creation, even fictionally, of new schools, movements, etc. It's not limited to social acceptance and things like this. So it would be an interesting example for it, but yeah, I'll leave it for another time. But it's certainly kind of like in this field or extension of this field itself. But given that I talk too much, and we're kind of running quite late already. This is my pathetic attempt to open this from just being too presentational, and as a question ask, given these kind of directions, if you were thinking as an impression, what kind of things you would like or desire to see from this kind of design field, if you could openly say anything? I mean, some of the things you have said already touch upon this, but like that this could be a question for everyone, just as an open one. You don't have to have the responsibility of thinking how it could happen, but just as a interesting thought experiment, or potentially interesting one.
I mean, this might be completely, not wrong, but out of whatever, because as you know, I'm not sort of like a big gamer or whatever. But I keeps thinking about that thing that was in London by this sort of AR company during Freeze, that they were sort of placing AR artworks around, and I thought it was a little bit lame, honestly, because of many reasons, including the clunkiness of it all, and also I don't know, I just didn't really enjoy it. But it makes me think, instead of maybe using this sort of this pin logic to then something that could be more meaningful, or again more mission oriented. So what if you place these hints to something that it's either organizational or more towards learning or connecting, rather than it's like again showing art through AR. Like what if those pins or those hints or banners or hidden things are actually more meaningful organizational objects, or point you to some spaces where you could connect with some specific sort of people or agents. I don't know. It's, yeah, I'm just thinking about the potential of opening these doors and using the pins to open doors that are more meaningful than just simply showcasing AR artworks that are made so like not so well as well.
I agree that it is I think an interesting direction, and much more alongside the medium of AR, what it could do that is actually interesting. Like it's more like almost like adding depth to reality rather than
Exactly.
just placing a work on it. Like that there's suddenly more to what you're seeing, more possibilities and more meaning than what was there before.
Yep.
What about others? Any things that you would desire to see or create?
I'm really intrigued by this provocation from Tolgai around reversing the flow of sort of capital exchange in exchange for around attention, right? So instead of having my attention sort of mined and extracted from me, like what happens when that becomes a much more like honest exchange, an honest transaction where, hey, we would like your attention, and we're willing to expend some resources in order to have your attention. So, instead of just like stealing it from me, so to speak, in the least integrated way possible, what happens when that just becomes like a generative transaction where I have the ability to consent to, yeah, I'm willing to entertain my attention being taken, quote unquote, astray in this window of time. And there's something interesting around that.
Yeah, I agree. Like also like really rethinking attention. Like there's something somewhere in my extra writings which is talks about like two things, like economy of attention, but like a little bit towards the direction you're looking at, like how do we actually reformulate this economy of attention, but then economy of intention as well. Like how do we also build economy of intention, and how do these two things play together? Anybody else? Martin escaped. We're already like over or being passing our critical threshold of 2 hours. But anybody providing next to last words?
I just a short one. I'm kind of chasing my child here, but like remained listening as well.
Appreciate it.
Great talking and kind of great subject and really like great discussion and so on. I'm kind of interested in this sort of like assembling and kind of reorganizing and relocating objects and whatnot. And also what Linda said about AR and this like that has already been done, like a very situational like pieces, like relocating or kind of for instance, in was it like manifest.ar, this group that like kind of made their own exhibition in Venice Biennale, for instance, and MoMA like AR by AR and so on, at the same time when there was some other exhibition, official exhibition going on, and this like, but there was really very little like interaction and imagination involved, like no game like structures or anything like that. So really like playing with all this like kind of object symbols, signs, all that is of great interest to me.
Yeah, I think like really also object kind of reconceived is a really interesting. I'm not going to open that can of worms because it's a big, but I think a really fertile topic, um, of how to play with that and what do they mean. Like because much of the object meaning is conventionalized. Like art sort of tries to escape from that, but then the art structures around them become conventionalized and so on. And they do hold a lot of power, like latent, like power built into them. So how to kind of open that up a bit is definitely an interesting direction. And a short note on the situation is, Pablo noted this earlier, like one of my, like I've scoured around all that I could find in terms of where can I find techniques. And like one of the situationist was one of these movements that had a perfect starting point, but if you actually go what kind of tools they have, I sort of became disappointed that it's still like they're still organizing derivatives like the same format over decades, and then there are some interesting makers. They are not the big names, but the smaller names have done something interesting. But I think there was kind of a stopping point, which one was not because the people were stupid, but just that the cultural structural palette was not yet there. And I think this relates back to why there was this flourishing of this life and reality games after tabletop figured out this sort of relations with fiction. And I think that has been part of the process of developing how do we actually have tools for this, which is like a whole area that we have underdeveloped before. So yeah, I think like there's much more to develop in that area, and really even these sort of games were baby steps towards them, but they did have tools, like they did have instruments, they had like ways to design them, maybe in a more expansive sense than at least what was in the middle of situations.
Actually, I also not saying it's a conclusion around this for but seems like something can catalyze in real life, like taking like in an institutionalized way, regulated, or in that context people accept that maybe, but where this decision is given to people that actually lives there, like who rent them, not the owners of those buildings. So like and then maybe in a, let's say that building is somewhere that people works for some companies, those companies are the renters, but again within that cascades, I mean one more level, like hey, whoever works there, employees decide. Like yeah, like if I'm not aligning with something as an individual, why I'm going to that building, and like I don't know, I'm not saying like that, but maybe that's a bit too direct cut, but yeah, renters or whoever exposed like legally is whoever is going there or living there by default. But maybe that could change partially somewhere given, and then those people decide more with people outside, or more feel responsible about it. Yeah, and yeah, I wanted to add that.
I think actually that area is like there's this whole subfield to this, which is kind of like play of rights, and you can even argue that the way the form of the citizen that we're still kind of in, which then led to human rights as a structure, because citizen started as a right structure, that was created. It was a kind of a reality game. Like because we're long over, I don't open the kind of worms why like the early form ways of implementing citizenship were really games. They had to do it in that kind of manner. It was really kind of almost like the buttons that you gain the rights with a person you would recognize as a citizen, which was a small group, and then you had to obey the rights of that person having those rights, and so on. So they had to create these games to create the concept of citizen. But that all just in a summary fashion, that actually when we talk about our rights, they always come from a certain creation, and like also things like human rights and expanding them. But I think it's a very vital potential play area, is to start to design and give and find a way to make new kinds of rights living. So yeah, it's an interesting possibility. But I think we're arriving towards the end. And like, does anybody have last comments?
Kisses.
That's a good one. Goodbye. Goodbye. Somebody say something. Pablo, you can say something.
I really appreciated today's session. Yeah, I will be thinking of activating reality for play, and I'm looking forward for next time.
Thanks. Sorry for it being kind of too presentation-y, but it was kind of a lot of the things that connected to a lot of the other things with long past. So maybe it's works as a kind of info dump with some little curls of interaction on the side. But yeah, but I thank everybody, and I will now stop the